We actually think gas as a transition fuel, as we would call it, is terribly important, and it's very unlikely that the world could hit its climate targets, in inverted commas, without large deployment of gas, particularly in America, most likely China, and other areas. Europe already has a fair bit of gas. So gas is very important to buy us that 20 years for other technologies to continue to develop and so on, as the lowest carbon fossil fuel. So that's a huge market. And then I think, agriculture, we're extremely interested in, as we said, this food, water, energy. That in the food area, agriculture has got a tremendous challenge, not just from climate, but from demographics, from just having to feed everybody. So we think investments in agriculture and technologies in agriculture and so on are very interesting. And one shouldn't forget water. I mean, water could still yet trump all of that as being one of the biggest problems 50 years out. And therefore, what are the technologies and the opportunities in the water sector and so on. So it's all really a vast area, we think, is what we've called one of the mega trends.
Technologies like solar power in its various forms, they're progressing so fast, the costs are coming down. If you could combine that technology with the scaling up opportunities in countries like China, where manufacturing costs are dramatically improving the availability of that technology, with entrepreneurship in India and innovation that is taking place in Europe and North America, where we have more and more applications for that technology now, for the built environment in particular, where there's good 40-50% of the problem can be resolved. I'm very excited about the prospects of solar power. I think there are huge opportunities for engaging the public in a different kind of investment and savings, where a lot of confidence has been lost in the financial system, a lot of trust broken. I do think people will respond to the opportunity to invest in real assets, producing real dividends that they can use in their lives. They can make use of this infrastructure. And I think the Green Investment Bank that we've worked to create here in the UK is just one example of an institution that can sit between the capital markets and public policy and offer a long-term perspective on where money could be spent in the public interest. It's a public interest-based institution. And I think in due course, institutions like that can incentivize private savings to be deployed in the public interest in a way which we haven't seen enough of in recent times. So I'm quite confident that both on the technology and the finance side, there are innovations that can be brought to bear on the problem. And maybe the final area where we still haven't innovated sufficiently, in my view, is in business itself, the corporate structure. We have two clear distinctions between for-profit and not-for-profit. In the middle, there are all sorts of enterprises, which we currently call social enterprises, which I think can be organized around problem solving. And there's work to be done, but I'm quite optimistic that there's a generation behind us that actually want to work in a different way, that feel confident that they can remodel capitalism around problem solving institutions.
Energy efficiency is an obvious opportunity. Creating the financial architecture really and the politics around energy efficiency should be something which is possible, and you can do it fairly quickly with the right set of people. Then there's the technology solutions and getting technology into the right places at the right time. So the changes in price for solar and wind at the small scale. So how you incentivize a mass take-up of something like that. It's a huge opportunity if you can get the price points right, and it looks like the price point for something like solar will get there much quicker than we think. And that could trigger a revolution in energy provision, and therefore a revolution in the sorts of technologies that we then use for electricity.
It's clear developing countries, or big developing countries like Mexico, Korea, China, and certainly Brazil are investing in a lot of clean technology. And they're investing in efficiency, which offers an opportunity to change how their development will take shape. So we definitely need to encourage that going forward, because this is where consumption is going to occur, not in the developed world.
I think there's an understanding that the UN process is in real trouble, my sense, that it's got caught up in a really complex negotiating system that doesn't have huge confidence. There isn't impetus behind the negotiations, and I think there's a fairly widespread recognition that that process isn't working at the moment. At the same time, there is a sense that the world is moving on, and the markets and finance community is actually starting to invest in some of the solutions, and that we're not that far away from that really taking off.
As a realist, I would say that we are far away from finding a globally acceptable solution, because the East and West and North and South do exist. Even though we live in a globalized world, positions are still quite nationalist, quite based on economic interests, quite based on political interests.
We've seen over and over again that the levers to make things happen are so uncertain politically. I'm glad to be in the private sector working towards these ends. Not that I don't think it shouldn't be in the public sector, but I think that it's slow going there, and it needs to move faster, because when it does become a pinch, all options will be on the table. Obviously, de facto, all options are on the table now, but people are too sedentary to use them.
I think the main barrier is how we think, how we understand the problem, how we understand the challenge, how do we scope it out, and how do we share responsibility. It's not about penalizing someone, it's not about rewarding anyone, it's just about understanding our individual capacities and how we can pool all of them together and take on fair share of the global commitment towards finding a more sustainable, more equitable, a more morally and ethically sound society.
There is no technological fix to this. Much of the change is behavioural. Much of that behavioural change is driven by perceptions about the world, often wrong, not informed by facts. So there's a lot of communication, information sharing, networking, organising of responses that can provide a positive narrative for change. That's absolutely essential. It's not a byproduct of anything else. It's essential. After that, there is opportunity to really challenge the incumbents on their own terms, by which I mean there are technological alternatives. There are alternative business models. One can do utilities differently. One can supply energy reliably and effectively without dependency upon fossil fuels. But there's an awful lot that needs to be done to create the sociological conditions where that's possible, where people feel positively empowered to make that change, whether they be an individual or a community or a corporation.
People started talking about this connection of food, energy and water, and how people working in the different areas were perhaps a little disconnected, and how in fact they interact a lot, and how you can get a lot of unintended consequences from trying to tackle one of the areas. And then there really was the question, well, then it gets so complex, can you really sort of deal with it when you get to that level of complexity? Isn't it better just to sort of stay in your own area and hope for the best? But I actually think, we're going to see more work about the interconnectedness of these different areas and what the impacts they're having, and are there unintended consequences, and are there better ways to sort of manage think about the whole thing, and we may just have to.
I'm unashamedly somebody who tries to keep on sort of saying, okay, that's fine, but we've got this problem, which is to stabilise greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in a reasonable space of time. What contribution is this likely to make? And there are still not all that many people who are capable of or interested in answering questions in their own field with a really laser-like focus on that.
I think the biggest problem we face is the uncertainty in markets. This is particularly true of clean tech and energy efficiency because investors do not know either how to price the capital stream or really understand the value of the underlying asset they're investing in. It's also true of clean tech. You'll know in the United States, the policy incentives for solar, wind, and certain efficiency standards in green buildings are likely to expire. And when they expire, that will restructure the market. And so people are unwilling to invest now if they don't see a long-term potential for those investments.
The private sector action to say, here are some solutions, we need to roll this out. Whereas the political machinery is finding it very difficult to come up with a solution to creating that environment which allows all of these things to go to scale, because it involves a lot of change. And it's change that's uncertain, it's change that is around the business as usual paradigm, so there's lots of vested interests in not really keeping things as they are, but uncertain of the risks involved in moving to this new green economy, whatever we want to call it. So trying to understand why that disconnect exists, and we had some discussion about that, but there's a lot more that can be unearthed about actually why is there this big disconnect between here are lots of opportunities, they create jobs, they create technologies, it's what the economies and politicians are really keen on usually, but the difficulties of then translating that into real action and saying yes, we can now change our entire energy policy or encourage private sector to move into investment. It's still a challenge.
How one thinks about this sort of societally is one of the big questions. Is it possible for the human mind to comprehend all of this? Do some of the new software tools, mapping tools, systems analysis tools, causal loop diagrams, allow us to come any closer, the global climate models and whatnot? I think we need to do both. We need to make the efforts we can to understand what's happening systemically, but then each of us individually needs to figure out some part of that on which to work and go forward. I doubt very much that if we had one ruler of the planet, that person would be able to say, okay, here's everything we should do, as opposed to, if we can sort of have a sense of what the system is and then incentivize the markets or incentivize individuals to continue to do the things that make sense, then I think we actually will probably have a more innovative, more sustainable path forward. But that's the big question, as we get more people and as we consume more, can we possibly survive? We don't try to answer that question in these meetings, but rather each of us say, okay, what can we do to make the work that we do on a daily basis more powerful in this broader context, recognizing that we don't have our arms around the whole thing.